How can we view the prospects of the United Nations in this year, 1964, 19 years after the initial ratification of the Charter? Well, I think we're entitled to answer with qualified, cautious optimism. It's true that the world still is full of frightful danger. We have the tragic division between East and West. We have the spread of nuclear capability posing an immense danger to the health and safety of humanity. And many of the emerging nations are finding the responsibilities of independence unexpectedly heavy. But on the other hand, for 20 years now, we have managed to avoid all-out, unmanageable, catastrophic war. And there are some grounds for hoping that a human urge to survive will do something to save the peace in the future. And East and West may have taken a few halting steps toward accommodation. Now, there is some relationship between these encouraging aspects of the today's world situation and the role of the United Nations in the past 2 decades. Now, prevention of all-out war is not, of course, solely due to the work of the organization, but there have been particular crises which might have drifted into the ultimate weapons stage if the United Nations had not been available, or its services had not been available. Now, too, the significance of the day-to-day work of the non-political relief, rehabilitation, technical assistance, and developmental activities of the various UN agencies, the significance of these is perhaps greater than any of us imagine. Now, similarly, contact among world leaders within the UN may have contributed more than anyone can know to a rapport which has made it easier for them to negotiate differences, sometimes informally. We have then many intangibles here that are difficult to measure. Now, going to the other side again, it's tempting to observe that the degree of instability, fear, suspicion, danger existing in the world today assess very little for the effectiveness of the United Nations. But it's hardly fair to take this line, because much of today's tragedy, most of it perhaps, is rooted in the lack of a sense of world community at a time when the world has become a community with common problems of extraordinary urgency. And no mere organizational structure can by itself quickly manufacture this sense of community or create the conditions for resolving the differences. In fact, if the UN should aspire to operate as a true world government in the face of these existing divisions, I think the result could only be either complete failure or the despotic dominance of one or the other of the two power blocks. But the UN, of course, is not a world state, and this is a reality which should be reassuring to hard-bitten opponents of one worldism. Reinhold Niebuhr has aptly called it a minimal bridge between a deeply divided East and West. Now, fundamentally, in carrying out its mandates, the UN cannot rely on legal power and authority, the legal power and authority to compel, in the same way that sovereign states possess this power and authority. The pressures at its command are, for the most part, indirect and moral, and it has to rely very heavily on persuasion. The size of the so-called UN peacekeeping forces in key areas of the world Well, that's ludicrous compared to the armed establishments, of course, of the great powers. Now, given the deep divisions of the world and the unwillingness of either side to trust the other, these limitations on the UN are inevitable, and I don't think that in the foreseeable future there will be any major strengthening of the organization. But we can dare hope that in time and in response to developing urgency, the UN may evolve into something more effective. Now, certainly in the 19 years since its inception, it has shown a rather remarkable adaptability to changing conditions. For example, those who wrote the UN Charter seem to have assumed that the amity established amongst Great Britain and the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II would continue into the post-war era, and that this amity would make the Security Council the organization's most effective arm and agency. Well, as we all know, Soviet-American amity broke down even before the guns of World War II had cooled. And soon the Security Council found itself deadlocked and stymied. Now, perhaps this should have marked the demise of the UN. But the remarkable fact is that it didn't. Somehow or other phases of the total operation compensated for Security Council ineffectiveness. Now, in recent years, and particularly during the tenure of Dag Hammarskjöld, as the Secretariat of the organization came to play a role beyond what was originally intended. Now, at the same time, the failure of East and West to agree on a permanent peacekeeping force was in a sense made up for, compensated for, by the special ad hoc forces, such as those that patrolled the frontiers between Israel and the Arab states, and which sought with, to be sure, something less than complete success to establish stability in the Congo. Now, along with the Secretariat, the General Assembly has also assumed a more important role than perhaps was originally anticipated, especially for the emerging nations. And the great powers have shown a great reluctance to overtly oppose the mandates of the General Assembly, which on some occasions, a few occasions, have been translated into action by the Secretariat. You have here a kind of a vacuum in certain areas of the world where both the great power blocks are disengaged, where they are reluctant to become engaged, and in which the UN perhaps has some potentialities for operating. Well, this suggests that in the future there may be additional changes, and these additional changes will, perhaps we might hope, increase the organization's effectiveness. Now, it can't, of course, be predicted with complete confidence that this capacity to adapt assures the UN's future. There are many difficulties that cloud this future, including the difficult problem, for example, of financing peacekeeping operations. But it may not be extravagant to hope that insofar as organizational structures can contribute to the resolution of the agonizing political problems that face the world today, the UN then has a potentiality for service. Well, now I realize that there has been a note of qualified, tentative optimism. Here, I've deliberately tried to strike this in talking about the UN. And perhaps this doesn't seem quite inspirational enough for the occasion. Now, if it seems that way, let me reply that it is necessary for us Americans to abandon naive confidence in quick, total, one-shot solutions to extraordinarily difficult situations, either through the UN or through other instrumentalities. Now, our historic disposition to expect total redemption was pointed out for me this weekend in some reading that I was doing. This was quite apart from the UN or international affairs. It was, as a matter of fact, in the area of 19th century economic thought. But it provided a good example of this particular spirit. Now, in advocating the protective tariff, Matthew Carey, an eminent economist, and he wasn't running for office either, he wasn't out on the hustings, he was on an academic platform, proclaimed that if the tariff would be adopted, it, and I'm quoting him now, would find husbands for old maids and free the entire sex from an age-old bondage. It would also make southern planters rich and ultimately free the slave. But this wasn't even all. It would, in addition, lower the bastardy rate, improve morals, eliminate crime and war. This is what the tariff would do. Now, this was not from a crackpot, but from a highly respected economist. We might also cite the case of Edward Atkinson, another 19th century economist who invented the Aladdin oven. And he was confident that this would save the American working man 5 cents a day on his meals. And this, in turn, would solve the problem of poverty. He told one of his friends that when he died, he wanted inscribed on his monument, Edward Atkinson taught the American people to stew, and that this effected a real revolution. Well, the experience of the past 2 generations has invalidated this kind of rosy optimism and has confronted us with the need to make a profound spiritual and mental adaptation. And there are many dangers we confront in making this adaptation. There is the danger that in making it we will swing too far in the direction of pessimism and a sense of total futility, and ignore all the redemptive possibilities that we find in society. Or there's also the danger that we will desperately and compulsively hold on to our optimism by suppressing those aspects of experience which tend to undermine it. Now, the proper response to this problem, and this is relevant to what we're saying about the UN here too, seems to me was defined a few years ago by a Peace Corps recruiter who visited our campus. He said that what the Peace Corps needed and what he thought America needed was a sense of mission which wouldn't be dissipated by the first failure to achieve utopia. Well, I think that we can adopt this too then as a kind of a frame of reference, or as kind of a rule when we evaluate the prospects of the United Nations.